All right, so just 3 slides left. We are cruising. Let me just hide that there. Okay, so we were talking about the war on terror, and for all of the Bush administration, 2001 to 2009, the war on terror really dominated the Bush administration. Um, as a country, we were really focused on foreign policy, on global terrorism, on Al Qaeda, on the aftermath of September 11th. Now, that's not to say that there weren't important developments at home. There certainly were, but they tended to be overshadowed by foreign policy and the war on terror. Certainly during his first administration, and I would argue into the first half of his second administration. At home, Bush is a Reagan conservative. What you saw with Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush is going to do much of the same, or he's going to pursue policies that are very similar. Tax cuts, socially conservative, religious, evangelical Christians, supporting the evangelical Christian agenda, pro-life, all these sorts of socially conservative policy goals are George W. Bush as well. No Child Left Behind is a development during the George W. Bush administration. I don't really know how significant it's going to turn out to be in terms of history. At the time, No Child Left Behind was a pretty big deal. It has since lapsed, and it no longer really exists. Education tends to move in cycles, and No Child Left Behind as a cycle lasted for about a generation, early 2000s into the mid 2010s. The goal of No Child Left Behind was to raise the standards in American education, primarily through standardized testing. No Child Left Behind was going to set benchmarks for schools to hit. It was going to provide some help to hit those goals, although a lot of No Child Left Behind was what we call an unfunded federal mandate, basically telling schools they had to do these things and not giving schools any financial help with doing those things. And so, I said No Child Left Behind has a mixed legacy. It no doubt helped many students and schools. It raised standards in many areas, but it also created a great deal of paperwork, red tape that schools had to do. In some ways, like the spate of testing that you guys have to go through in order to just exist in high school or middle school or elementary school is a legacy of No Child Left Behind. And so whether you like that or don't like that, it depends on your perspective. The tech bubble I mentioned in part one during the 1990s, which was driving a lot of growth in the 1990s, bursts in the early 2000s. Really in 2000, there's a bubble that bursts. And that is going to hurt the economy, although the economy is going to recover pretty quickly in the early 2000s. What really hurts at the end of the W. Bush administration is the Great Recession, and you can see that here. The Great Recession is due to subprime mortgages, what are referred to as subprime mortgages. The restrictions on lending for mortgages had been loosened after the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act in 1999. Glass-Steagall Act was this act that created the FDIC during the Great Depression in the 1930s, but it also put some rules on banking, specifically like commercial banking and private banking. And those restrictions were loosened, and it led to banks making some pretty risky loans. And you can see that when you look at the increase of what are referred to as subprime mortgages. Subprime mortgages were high-risk mortgages that were handed out to lenders, to people who wanted to buy a home that were risky. People were buying homes that, quite frankly, they probably should not have. They were too much home for the person. They cost too much money for what people were making. And eventually there was a bubble that was created. And when that bubble burst, the housing market collapsed and things got real bad real quick into 2007 and 2008. The federal government passed a couple measures that were to try to prop up the economy. These are measures that were in the hundreds of billions of dollars. And their goal, much like we saw with the New Deal in some ways, was to make sure that banks and corporate entities did not collapse. And so there was a lot of fear over the Great Recession. It was the worst recession we've had since the Great Depression. There was also a lot of debate over the actions that the federal government took should have took, didn't take, did take. We don't need to get into it here because it's not really, it's not a push. But yeah, so that's the Great Recession. And that leads us into the election of 2008. In the election of 2008, we see Barack Obama, who runs against John McCain, and Obama, of course, wins. It's a milestone moment in American history because Barack Obama is the first African American to be elected as president of the United States. He is the first non-white dude to be president of the United States. And he takes office at a difficult time for the United States. The United States is still fighting both wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And the United States is in a deep, deep recession when he takes over after that housing bubble has burst. Obama is going to make it his goal to end the wars on terror, and he is sort of successful in that. In Iraq, the war is wound down, or I should say the presence of the American military in Iraq is wound down, and an end to major combat operations is declared in 2001, although the United States is going to keep some troops there for a little while after that. In Afghanistan, Obama is able to find and kill Osama bin Laden, the leader of al-Qaeda and the architect of September 11th. Osama bin Laden had fled into Pakistan, where he was found and killed by U.S. troops in May of 2011. So that was a big moment in the war on terror. This is very much a mixed bag. I alluded to this with Iraq and how Iraq is destabilized and it allows for the creation of this power vacuum, which lets ISIS take control. Afghanistan is a similar mixed bag. We spend 20 years there. The Biden administration in 2021 is actually the ones who pull American troops out in 2021, and the Taliban actually takes over again in 2021, and that's the current state of Afghanistan today. The Taliban is back in power in 2021. So it is, the wars on terror, depending if you want to pluralize it or not, it's up to you, very much a mixed legacy. And I'm curious to see in the next 10, 20 years what historians make of those conflicts in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. Something else which happens during the Obama years is the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring starts in late 2010 in Tunisia and spreads very quickly. Most notably to Egypt. And the Arab Spring is pro-democracy movements which are going to sweep across the Middle East and Africa. I would say that they are unsuccessful in spreading democracy to the places where the Arab Spring is attempting to. But it is a positive sign, at least as far as the West is concerned, that democracy is continuing to spread and is continuing to have resonance in societies that are not very democratic. And so that's the Arab Spring. I already mentioned ISIS, so I won't talk about it again. Russia is becoming more aggressive during the Obama administration, specifically his second term. Russia annexes Crimea, the Crimean Peninsula, which was a disputed region. Ukraine had claimed control of it. Russia annexes it, does not run into much resistance when it annexes Crimea, and it's a harbinger of things to come for when Russia invades Ukraine just a couple years later. The annexation of Crimea definitely emboldens Vladimir Putin to believe that the West will not stand in his way, and that if he wants to further expand, he will be able to do so. Obama's trying to normalize our relationship with Cuba. We've not had diplomatic relations with Cuba since their revolution in 1959. We still don't really have normalized relations with Cuba. I think the Trump administration rolled that back, but it's not too important anyway. Domestic events, we talked about the government bailing out many of these large corporate entities which are on the verge of collapse during 2008 and 2009. The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act as a part of that. Financial reforms, yeah, there's some of that, but the big one is Obamacare. Barack Obama makes it his primary goal to pass universal health care in the United States. He does not accomplish that. He passes or I guess Congress passes a halfway measure, which is the Affordable Care Act. In theory, the Affordable Care Act mandates that all Americans have health insurance, and it helps Americans get that health insurance, and it helps Americans to pay for that insurance. But it is not universal health care. It is not socialized medicine. It's a halfway measure. It's a compromise bill. Still exists today. I don't know where, I have no idea what the legacy of this will be. It'll depend on where our country goes in the next 10 to 20 years in regards to the healthcare debate. There's still a lot of Americans who say that we need universal healthcare. There's still a lot of Americans who want to repeal Obamacare. It's still something that our country is fighting over. We also see during Obama's first term the growth of the Tea Party. And the Tea Party is a movement on the right, the political right, to take back the country in their eyes, and to recommit the United States to conservative values, economic and social, primarily. The Tea Party is what's going to lead us right into the Trump presidency, and this is our last slide. Now, I'd be pretty surprised if you see anything relating to Donald Trump on the APUSH exam. As you guys know, he's such an explosive figure still that I would guess College Board wants to avoid accusations of overly politicizing the exam. But it could happen. I mean, this is getting to the point where it's history. He was elected in 2016. Something from 2017 is, it's 7-8 years ago now at this point. So we're getting into the historical. That being said, you guys know Trump is running for a second term. I'd be pretty surprised if the College Board put something on there about Trump. Trump. I mean, you're living through Trump. If you're paying attention to the current political discourse in our country, you know who Trump is, what he stands for. He's a disruptor. He is very much a populist figure. He is appealing to the masses in some very specific ways. He is a ethnic nationalist. He is running a campaign that is focused on America. He is not concerned about foreign policy, or if he is concerned about foreign policy, it is in lessening America's role in the world and focusing on America and the domestic. Tax cuts, yeah, but really he's very different in some ways to Reagan Republicans, specifically in terms of our global presence, our global military presence, but also in his populist rhetoric and how he is appealing to people. Yeah, I mean, Trump has been investigated for numerous things. The extent to which the Trump campaign was colluding with Russia during the 2016 election, that's the first thing that he's impeached for. In 2019, he was eventually acquitted in 2019 in a party line vote. We see throughout the Trump presidency, employment is pretty low. Economically, it's a pretty good time. We've recovered from the recession, the Great Recession of 2008. But then the pandemic hits in March of 2020 with COVID. We go into COVID lockdown for a couple months. And again, something I don't really need to tell you guys too much about since you lived through it. Trump also has a role to play on January 6, 2021. Trump loses the election in November of 2020 to Joe Biden. On the day that the election results were supposed to be certified, he makes a speech, a ways away from the Capitol, and he encourages his supporters to march to the Capitol and make their voices heard. And then many of those supporters break into the Capitol. And talk about a thing that our society's still going to have to figure out in terms of its legacy. Most, I think, would say that this is an attempt to stop the democratic, peaceful transition of power. The goal of many of the protesters was to get President Trump installed as the next president, or to at least stop the handing off of power to Joe Biden, to stop the certification of those results. But the extent to which Trump was the leader of this, the instigator of this, is still something that our society is grappling with. Even today, as we speak, there are cases that are yet to be decided over the extent to which Trump and his campaign or officials or whatever I guess not campaign, he was president, his officials meddled in the election of 2020, meddled in the events of January 6, 2001. And again, speaking of things that I don't need to tell you about, increasing political polarization is a hallmark of the Trump presidency. It's actually the playbook of Donald Trump to divide and conquer, to separate the country, the world into them and us, and to carve out a narrow path to victory. Because Trump really does have a narrow path to victory. In 2016, he barely wins. In 2024, his path to victory is equally as narrow. We are so divided in this country that it's very hard for a candidate to get over 50% of the vote. Not impossible. In November, we'll find out, but very, very divided. And that is where I leave you. Again, I'd be pretty surprised to see anything from the last roughly 10 years on the exam. I have seen questions pertaining to Obama's presidency, but anything beyond that, I think it's just too recent. Don't quote me on it. It's quite possible that something shows up from the recent, especially if they try to tie it back to an earlier time period. Like rising xenophobia in the country and tying that back to the 1920s or something like that. Totally doable. All right, we'll end the notes there, and yeah, that's it. All done for today.